Tonight we've come to Glasgow, and for 18 years the SNP have dominated the political landscape here. But in July there was a change at the general election when Labour won a huge majority of seats in Scotland, leaving many to think the SNP's best days might just be behind them. But maybe, just maybe, things could be changing yet again. In the last few hours, our audience members have been arriving and have been preparing their questions and opinions for our political guests. And as a group, as usual, they reflect the general electoral picture tonight across Scotland. And tonight they've got plenty of questions for both the Labour and SNP governments, and they really want to talk about Donald Trump. Welcome to Question Time from Glasgow. From the SNP is the Scottish Government Deputy First Minister Kate Forbes. 2 years ago, she came very close to leading her party and being First Minister. She's also Cabinet Secretary for the Economy. From the UK Labour Government is Energy Minister Michael Shanks. His party won 37 seats here in the Westminster election last July, 36 more than the previous election. Russell Findlay's been leader of the Scottish Conservatives since last autumn. Before politics, he was an investigative journalist, focusing especially on organised crime. Despite Labour's success last year, his party retained the second highest number of seats in Holyrood. Lorna Slater is the co-leader of the Scottish Greens, who want an independent and green Scottish Republic. She was a minister in the government here for nearly 3 years before her party's power-sharing agreement with the SNP collapsed last April. And the columnist Alex Massie writes for The Times and The Sunday Times. He also co-presents the Ponsonby and Massie podcast, which claims to have the inside track on politics from a Scottish perspective. Welcome to our panellists. Great to see you all. Welcome to our audience here. Great to see you as well. And, of course, welcome to you at home. You can join in the whole conversation about this programme on social media. Or who knows, you could just sit back and watch. Anyway, let's take our first question, which is from Joe Fell.
Donald J. Trump was elected 47th President of the United States. But when was he elected Master of the Universe?
It's one way of putting it. Kate.
Well, do you know the most infuriating thing about Donald Trump is that he makes inflammatory statements to dominate the news cycle, and then all we do is talk about him, obliging him in what he wants. And he is not the master of the universe. He may have an America First policy himself, and he is democratically elected as the President of the United States. Here in Scotland, my job is to deliver for the Scottish people and to support our ambitions. And that includes world peace. That includes ensuring that we support our closest neighbours. That includes ensuring that our trade and our export and our businesses are thriving.
So Donald Trump sees himself as a man who wants peace, and he's made this proposal for Gaza, which I'm sure all of you are familiar with, which is basically empty it out, get companies in there to build a new, beautiful new land, is the way he describes it. What's your response to that?
I mean, it is reprehensible for anybody to suggest that people should be forcibly removed from their homeland.
So are you saying that he is reprehensible in suggesting that?
Well, I would suggest that he makes these comments, as he has made many comments, in order to get a lot of attention and to publicly dominate the conversation. But there's two great concerns I have right now. Not only have the people of Gaza come through the most horrendous times, with the most recent UN report suggesting that at least 45,000 have died, and alongside that, 1,000 Israelis. There are hostages that still haven't been returned. We are in the early days of a fragile ceasefire. And those of us who want to see peace and a two-state solution are deeply concerned by anything that destroys that ceasefire. And the suggestions and the comments are just completely unacceptable. And I think on this, world leaders should unite in opposing any efforts to forcibly remove people from their homeland.
Would you use those words, reprehensible?
Well, I think it's really important that I don't commentate as a British government minister on what the US government is saying and what President Trump is saying. Apart from anything else,
Why
I
not?
actually agree with Kate that I think there's a real danger we wake up every morning to whatever press conference has gone on during the night in America, and that becomes the news cycle that we respond to in this country. And I'm really keen that we focus on what the priorities are for our country here. And that we don't,
which is great, and we'll be doing that. But what lots of people have asked about, and that's the reason we chose Joe's question, there were lots and lots of questions, more questions about anything else, about Donald Trump and his proposal, which of course include Gaza, tariffs, all sorts of things. So we will come to the Labour government shortly, I'm sure. But in terms of Donald Trump, what do you make of his proposal?
Well, look, I think on this particular proposal, I'd be very, very clear that the British government does not agree, and we've been very clear that the Palestinian people fundamentally have a right to return to their homes. Of course, many of their homes have been destroyed, and they now need support to rebuild their homeland, and the UK government put £70 million more into aid to help with that, and we'll look at more in the weeks and months ahead. The Palestinian people have a right to return to their homeland. But Kate's point, I think, is really important. We have a ceasefire just now. It's taken a long time to get to this point, but it is incredibly fragile. And we have to make sure that this ceasefire isn't a temporary pause in the conflict, but is sustainable, so that we can then build towards a genuine peace process where the Palestinian people aren't just returning home, but they actually are returning home to a sovereign Palestinian state. That's the only way that we deliver long-term peace in the region, and that's what we absolutely have to work towards as a whole world community.
Man at the back.
So despite Donald Trump's suggestion being quite radical and a breach of the Geneva Convention, if the United States is not going to rebuild the Palestinian homeland, who will?
All right, let's hear the woman here.
What we're not talking about is the Israeli determination to take over the Gaza Strip, supported by the US and the United Kingdom, who are arming Israel despite what some of us would call ethnic cleansing of Palestine. And we are not saying enough to say we are against that. We're mealy-mouthed about the whole ethnic cleansing thing, and I think it's wrong. And we should be much more upfront about it.
Lorna.
I think you're absolutely right to use the word ethnic cleansing, and I think that doesn't even capture the full horror of trying to erase a state, to erase a people. And that's after 15 months of bombardment in which their homes have been laid to rubble, in which time women and children, about half of the 45,000 deaths were women and children, who were held collectively responsible for the heinous atrocities that Hamas committed. And during that bombardment, they had water withheld, food withheld, medical care withheld from them. And now they're being told that, you know, Donald Trump is going to take over, remove Palestine from the map entirely, remove Palestinians from Palestine so that he and his billionaire pals can build a resort. I think the sensible question is not only who elected Donald Trump, who elected Elon Musk?
OK. Alex.
Well, I mean, it's clearly suboptimal that the American people have, in their wisdom, chosen to re-elect as a president for a second time a copper-bottomed ocean-going imbecile. Sort of bona fide moron. But it is what it is, and that makes life extraordinarily difficult for every country in the world. I mean, Trump's Gaza policy, if one can dignify it as such, is clearly grotesque. This notion that it could be the Riviera of the Middle East is not any kind of serious proposal, save to the extent that it sends the message, I think, if there is a message at all, that what he wants, because he's not suggesting the United States will pay for any of this, what he wants is other Arab countries, Egypt, Jordan, Saudi Arabia, the Emirates, etc., to pay for the reconstruction of Gaza. Now, whether that happens...
What about some of his other policies, Alex? I mean, like...
Well, they're not very much
there's been
better.
a flurry, hasn't there, of executive orders. He's pulled out of the Paris Agreement, out of the World Health Organization. He has introduced and then pulled back from, in a couple of instances, in 3 instances, in fact, tariffs on other countries in order to extract concessions.
Yeah, I mean...
Can you see any virtue in anything that he's doing?
Well, not especially, but, you know, it's part part of I mean, the thing with Trump is that, as Steve Bannon, his advisor in his first term, said, you know, what we're going to do is flood the zone, basically. That we're going to throw so much stuff out there that our opponents, which he includes the media in that, will be permanently off balance. They won't know what to focus on. There'll be so many targets for them that they won't be able to coalesce around opposing any individual measure. And to that extent, you'd have to say that Trump's first few weeks in office, if judged by that measurement, have been a success on his own terms. Now, the fact that that his policies make very little sense objectively and would be actively damaging to the American people themselves, particularly in terms of his approach to tariffs, you know, is neither here nor there as far as Trump is concerned. He is a showman, and so as long as he is the star of his own reality show, then that is all that really counts. But it puts other governments, particularly friendly governments, in a very, very difficult position. You know, Michael, you know, some of you were a little unfair on Michael when he said, you know, well, as a UK government minister, I don't want to talk about Donald Trump very much. But, you know, the thing is that Trump pays attention to what people say about him. He bears grudges. He is extraordinarily thin-skinned. Loose words from Keir Starmer or David Lammy or whatever are the sort of thing that could invite all sorts of retribution against the United Kingdom. Now, that's not a very dignified situation for His Majesty's government to find itself in, but it is unfortunately a realistic one. And so navigating these waters is extremely perilous. And I think we should also remember that this is only month one of a four-year administration. And, you know, it would be unwise, I think, to waste too much energy right now when the UK government and other NATO countries have to take some time to work out how they're going to respond to Trump and his provocations over the next 4 years.
OK, let me hear a bit more from our audience. Man there in the jacket and the blue shirt.
So I understand, apart from the fact that I believe Trump lives in his own universe, made the statement about the Riviera, what is disappointing and concerning is the lack of a firm response, not just from the UK government, but for the Western government. Can you imagine if China made a similar statement about Taiwan?
Well,
what would have been the reaction?
Well, but the difference is that China isn't an ally, that China isn't the most important country in the world, that it isn't the most important country in NATO. So our relationship with the Chinese government vis-à-vis Taiwan is plainly of a different order to our relationship with the United States, for better or worse. And that is what makes it so complicated and so difficult for not just the United Kingdom, but for Germany, the Netherlands, for France, for Italy, for Canada.
Don't you think that Trump is behaving in a bullish way right now?
Yes,
between tariffs, between buying Greenland or invading Greenland, doing the same to Canada, Mexico, the Gulf of America. This is the behavior of somebody that has a particular view of the universe, where he's at the center of it, but it's also the behavior of a bully. And I think whether we are the closest nation to the United States of America or the close ally as a Europe, we need to be firm to make him understand that he cannot make statements like this.
OK, Russell, should we be standing up more to Donald Trump?
Well, whether or not we like Donald Trump and all the things that he has said, he is the democratically elected President of the United States, our most important ally. 140 million Americans cast their vote for him, and we have to live in the world that we live in, not the world that we would like to be living in. And one thing that we have to be acutely conscious of, and Alex Massie touched upon this, is that Donald Trump does bear grudges and he does listen to what people say about him. And we have to be conscious of the fact that he is on the rampage in respect of tariffs. There's a very real chance he might seek to apply tariffs on the United Kingdom, and that could potentially have a great impact on Scottish jobs directly in relation to the Scotch whisky industry. And so going back to Joe's point, he's not the master of the universe, but he does have profound power and reach that could very well impact on jobs in this country.
So we let him bully us?
I don't think we let anyone bully us, but what we do is we recognise the fact he does have this power, and we engage diplomatically at all levels. And I think politicians in positions of power in Scotland who go out their way to make personal criticisms of him, it could potentially be counterproductive. Diplomacy goes a long way.
Let me just see, because there's a few hands up. I just want to ask, not necessarily in terms of Gaza, but in terms of other things that Donald Trump is doing, as I say, there's been a tsunami of announcements that come from Donald Trump just the last week. Can anyone here see any merit in what Trump is doing, in his approach to? Okay, yes, let's hear from you.
Just when I hear the word bullying, I would just want to reflect on Scotland and Scotland's mental health. Nothing is getting done about that.
Okay, I'm asking you about Trump. I totally take your point. But can we just stick with Trump just for a minute? Just let me hear that, and we may come back to that in a later question, if you'll forgive me. Anyone here who thinks there is some merit in what Donald Trump's doing? Yes, man at the back with the green shirt.
I think that's the wrong question.
Oh. I stand corrected, sir. What should it be?
Let me qualify that, because the merit in his strategies are what his objectives are. So there is a merit in what he's doing. It's whether we agree with that or not. And what dismays me is that this is not a surprise. Donald Trump's actions have all been mapped out for some time. What surprises me is that our politicians don't seem to have a strategy that manages the balances of working with him as he is the President of America, but also challenging some of his actions, because without that challenge, it normalises what he's doing.
Man in the white shirt over there.
Proposal to rebuild Palestine is something that needs to happen. I think what I would have liked to have seen is the neighbouring Arab states around Palestine actually preempting something like this, to actually come together and actually be the ones that suggest this is how we're actually going to rebuild Palestine, this is how we're going to actually provide temporary accommodation for those that are displaced, and come together collectively so that this doesn't become another Trump story.
So you think, in fact, he's stimulating a conversation about that? Do you think that's what he's doing?
I would like to think so. I'd like to think there's going to be an Arab state response to that. But I think history tells us that they're not necessarily joined up when it comes to this sort of thing. But I would have liked them to collectively have got together and preempted this by showing a bit more support for their, their Palestinian sort of neighbours.
Anyone else who's think Trump's is, I say, not necessarily on Gaza, there's a whole load of things, but Trump is actually making some sensible suggestions? Yes.
Yeah, I don't think it's about what we think about the merit of what he's doing. I think it's about his supporters. And I think when it comes to things like immigration and his strong stance of actually now rounding people up, and they are seeing that visibly being done, he's doing
what he said he'd do.
Absolutely. And to them, that is going to be a merit to them, because they see what he's doing.
I'm going to take one last final point. Your man at the very back.
Yeah, I think some of his policies and executive orders have been absolutely abhorrent, particularly the withdrawal of diversity and inclusion policies in the federal government. However, he is a bullish businessman, and what he will do, if anything, is he will drive people to a negotiating table. That's surely got to be a merit in itself, because people need to talk. Stop isolating, get together and help rebuild that Palestinian homeland, because otherwise the people won't have anywhere to go to seek refuge.
All right, thank you for that. Right, I suspect Donald Trump will come back once more on the agenda. Only unless you speak in about 5 seconds, so we'll move on.
You know, for decades, people in Scotland have looked at at Ireland and said, look, you know, the Irish have all these presidents who claim to be Irish, you know, and now we have a president who's actually half Scottish and so on, and this is the one we get. There's something very Scottish about that.
All right, OK. Right, I do not doubt that Donald Trump will come up again on Question Time at some point, but I'm going to park it for now. Before I go on to our next question, I just want to tell you where we'll be next week, which is Northwich in Cheshire. So if you live in Northwich or around Northwich, you'd like to come and be part of our audience, follow the instructions on the Question Time website. We would love to see you. And then the week after that, we're going to be in London. And we're going to have a special focus on the war in Ukraine. It is 3 years since the invasion, and we will have a programme that, I say, is focusing on that. And we particularly like to have some Ukrainians in the audience. Ukrainians obviously living here in the UK. So do apply in the usual way, and particularly if you are Ukrainian, we really want to hear what you think as well, because you have absolutely got a stake in that. So, again, follow the instructions on the website, and we would love to see you. OK, next question. Graham McFadden. There you are.
Are the UK Labour government's policies advancing the cause for Scottish independence?
You got any in mind, Graham?
How long have you got? I think really just everything they've done so far. Like the beginning, we had the shirts and suits scandal. We've had the pensioners having their allowance taken away from, national insurance increases. I think a lot of people voted in Scotland at the general election to get rid of the SNP and are now regretting that fact from what you can see in the polls, that the situation, we have voted in a party that's even worse. So I'm just looking for the panel's opinion on that.
This is where Michael Shanks says, could we go back to talking about Donald Trump?
But I'm going to ask you.
Well, I disagree. And first of all, let me just pick up on some of the points you make. And I'd start by saying we've been in government for 8 months. And I say that because what we have had to deal with is 14 years of the most destructive, distracted, chaotic government we've seen that has left our public services in real trouble, that has delivered austerity year after year after year. And we've had to come in and pick up not one problem or two problems, but a multitude of problems and deal with them all at the same time. And I'd love to sit here and say that we could just sort of flick a switch and deliver the change that we absolutely want to see across this country. But the truth is, the long-term change that we need to deliver in this country will take time. And some of the actions that we've taken early on, in the budget, for example, ending austerity and investing in public services, is about getting money back into the services that we badly need to fund, the NHS in particular, which the SNP government now has money to spend to deal with. That was a key choice that we made early on. And
but
yes,
Michael,
we had to...
You must be disappointed, though. I mean, at the general election, it was a stunning result for Labour, 37 seats, where you previously had 1. Labour is now falling behind in the... Two, forgive me.
I was the second. Yeah.
Falling behind in... Yes, at a by-election. It was falling behind in the polls. You got Sir John Curtis, who was the guru of polling, as we know, saying the worst thing that happened to the Scottish Labour leader was Keir Starmer becoming Prime Minister.
Well, look, what I'm trying to say is there's no doubt we've had to make some really difficult decisions. We had to make some difficult decisions early on because of the fiscal mess that we inherited, where we had to make difficult financial decisions quickly so that we could then, in October, announce a budget that invested in public services. And just to be really clear, what that means in cash terms for Scotland is £5.2 billion more money to spend on education and roads and the NHS and everything else that needs to be spent in this country. The biggest budget that the Scottish Government has had since devolution began. Those are the choices we've chosen to make. Now, there have been difficult choices along the way, of course they are, and I'm acutely aware that some of these have been unpopular. But I have to say to you, the change this country needs can't be delivered overnight. And what we've had for 14 years is a government of slogans, of short-term sticking plaster solutions that get us from one PMQs to the next or one Prime Minister to the next, but don't deal with the fundamental problems in the country. And that's what we're determined to fix. And it will take time, but I promise you the change that we promised will be delivered.
There's lots of hands up, so I want to come round some of you quickly. Yes, Mandy, I think you've got a green top on, dark green top, yeah.
So, as the Energy Minister, you've said that you've been in for 8 months, so let's look at some of the promises that have been made. You talked about Grangemouth. Scotland is responsible for almost all the oil production in the UK, and we have so many oil refineries still down in England, but yet the last oil refinery in Scotland is closed down. This seems just like a spiteful move towards the Scottish, saying that we are going to cripple your oil refinery production so that you can't declare independence because you won't have this source of income.
OK, we are going to come... We may come to that subject later in the programme, so just hold that thought for now. Yes, man there in the sort of blue gilet.
Labour want to destroy the oil industry in Scotland. Totally, that's what they want. But they've been trying to do it all for years. That's it, just destroy them.
Man here in the yellow anorak.
Rachel Reeves announced a bunch of investment last week, is it? On the third one, Ray, Oxford, Cambridge, Arc. But none of these are in Scotland. Glasgow subway, the third oldest subway in the world, still only has one line. Edinburgh University, £800 million supercomputer shelved. HS2 doesn't even go to Manchester, let alone Scotland. So, you won't be able to deliver by 2026. SNP is going to be in power for 24 years, is it? What are you going to do?
OK, we'll come back to you at the end. This is Alex. You're sitting there smiling.
Well, because it's all quite funny, isn't it? You know, how rapidly, success can turn to ashes. But if I'm allowed to say this, I would suggest that Sir John Curtis, who you referenced there, Fiona, is wrong. It would be much, much worse for Scottish Labour if the Conservative Party had won the general election last July, and it would have been much, much better for the SNP if the Conservative Party had won last year's general election. Because, you know, when the questioner talked about independence and so on, well, when you have Nicola Sturgeon, and who am I to disagree with Nicola Sturgeon, saying that, you know, independence is not on the radar at present, that is a reflection of the changed circumstances that have resulted as a consequence of the general election result. And for all that, yes, Labour's popularity in Scotland has plummeted back to pre-election ratings and so on, you know, down to maybe 20, early 20s in the polls. And the SNP has ticked up a little bit. The SNP is now polling at around 33, 34% in Scotland. Well, from a unionist point of view, that's absolutely fine. Because an SNP that wins 33% of the vote is not an SNP party that is going to be able to do anything. They may be the largest party at Holyrood, but that isn't enough for the SNP. Because remember, in 2021, the SNP won around 47% of the vote at the last Scottish parliamentary elections. And they're now talking about, at best, polling maybe a dozen points below that. So it's not as though the SNP has enjoyed any kind of resurgence as a consequence of Labour's difficulties. What we do see, however, is obviously the growth of the Reform UK party, which is threatening actually all political parties in Scotland, not to the same extent, perhaps, as they are south of the border, but to a meaningful extent nonetheless. And that, obviously, I think, demonstrates the profound disillusion that many, many people, including plenty of people who don't actually support Reform UK but can understand some of the impulses which drive people towards reform, that disillusionment that people feel with political parties, whoever happens to be in government. Now, whether that was the Conservatives en route to their thoroughly justified and well-merited punishment beating last July, whether it's the SNP who've been in power now for 17 years, or whether it is the Labour Party who have only been in power for 8 months, but already, of course, to many voters look like a bit more of the same.
Well, who am I to disagree with Alex Massie? But I may pick you up on a few of those points. But the short answer to your question is yes. Voters have seen what happened to Scotland under the Conservatives. It was pretty bad. They've now seen what happens under the Labour Party. And for pensioners, waspy women, Grangemouth workers and family businesses, it's even worse. So if this is the best it's going to be, then I think for Scots across the country, they'll be wondering how we can do things differently. And we do things differently when we have power in the hands of the people. But, you know, Michael talked about the fact that the Tories depended on slogans. Well, it was one slogan, the slogan of change, that delivered the Labour result on the 4th of July. I reckon most people expected that change to lead to better things, not worse things. And there's not been much to be positive about in the last 18 months. There's not been much to be positive about.
Do you recognise the importance of it?
You were promised that your energy bills would go down by £300. All of you have had your bills hiked twice. You were promised that GB Energy would be established and would deliver a revolution in Scottish energy, resulting in lower bills and more jobs. We learned this week that there might be some jobs in about 20 years' time. You're all paying higher bills with more energy available, and now Grangemouth has had redundancy notices served on it. So there's been a lot of promises, haven't seen any of them kept, and Scotland has become an afterthought, as we saw in the Chancellor's speech.
Before I come to the substantive question put by Graham, I'd like to remind Michael Shanks that the Conservative government maintained the winter fuel payment for 14 years. Prior to coming into government, the Labour Party said that its removal would result in the deaths of thousands of pensioners, and that's exactly what they did. They removed it without any form of consultation or discussion. Turning to the point that Graham asked about independence, no, I don't think in any way that is the case. People in Scotland, I believe, are royally sick of this constant drumbeat of talking about breaking up our country. We've been trapped in this political paralysis, and at no point has Kate Forbes or any senior SNP politician come forward with any credible proposals as to how an independent Scotland would even function.
Why do so many people in Scotland pay higher energy bills and yet have such a surplus of energy?
I think most
Why do we
people
pay
in
higher
Scotland
taxes and have no better public services?
Well, I
Mr.
think
Massie,
that would be
Mr. Massie took the words right out my mouth. Why do people in Scotland earning £30,000 a year pay more income tax than they do?
Which means an extra
elsewhere?
£1.5 billion
free prescription, free bus travel for under 22s.
You're no longer in the government.
All of these things are true. The free bus travel for under 22s. Free bus travel for under 22s was a green achievement in government, and that is tackling the cost of living crisis, putting more money in your pockets. I don't know, anyone here get the free bus travel or have someone in their family who
Governments
does?
in Westminster
That is
come and
putting
go.
more money into
The UK
your
is here to
pockets
stay.
because the Greens were in government. And that is exactly why progressive taxation is so important. Those who earn a little bit more pay a little bit more, so everybody else can benefit from things like bus travel for young people.
Woman here in the front.
I think the 8-month honeymoon of Labour is well and truly over. For three reasons, in my opinion: the two-child cap and
the two-child benefit cap.
The two-child benefit, the removing of the winter fuel and the WASPy women, of which I am one. But what galls me the most, I know we shut WASPy women down a lot, is that 80 Labour MPs stood in their constituencies with these women, promising that they would do something. If I had 110 coffins, I would have put them outside this venue today, because that's how many women have died today without their money. 50,000 each of them.
Let me just remind people who aren't as familiar with the WASPy women. This is something like 3.5 million women who say they weren't informed properly about pension age changes. Yeah, no, just in case not everyone's familiar, and as a result have lost out, and the government has chosen not to compensate them. Yes, woman there in the striped top.
The Scottish Government have been in power for 17 years. You didn't see Grangemouth coming. It's a disaster. But it's been 17 years. Grangemouth has been coming for a long time. It's not come in the last 8 months. And as for Transport Scotland, excuse me, as for Transport Scotland, they have focused, Rachel Reeves, recently on the Cambridge-Oxford arc and things. She was talking to people down south. Up north, I'm from the islands. I'm not going to mention the word ferries. But there's the dueling of the A9. There's so many disastrous things that happen in Scotland that are lying at your door, not at the Labour government's door. Nobody else's.
Well,
Nobody else's.
I mean, would you want to talk about the ferries? We're going to come to Grangemouth in a minute, because we actually our next question. No, hang on. Our next question about energy. So I wouldn't shoot your bolt now.
I will answer your question at that point.
What about the ferries?
Well, we have plans to deliver 6 new vessels, and you're an islander. I represent the islands as well.
I know you do.
And I understand how critical
We've also just voted in somebody from Labour to represent the islands I'm from.
Yes, and I think they'll be sorely disappointed, considering that fuel poverty in our islands are higher than anywhere else in the United Kingdom.
Fuel poverty, that's the responsibility
of your
government. In terms of
delivering on transport infrastructure, we are delivering on it. The point is that in terms of our capital budget, we have inflation that's eating away at it, but the plan to deliver 6 vessels is on track.
Where are they built?
On the ferries,
Where are they built?
as somebody who uses
Not
CalMac
Scotland.
at least a dozen times a year, it behooves me to remind Kate that there are of the major fleet vessels in the CalMac fleet, more of them were launched when Margaret Thatcher and John Major were Prime Minister than have been launched in the 17 years the SNP have been in office in Edinburgh. But, you know, on the Labour government question, Zod, I mean, the tragedy for Labour is that, you know, no good deed goes unpunished. Labour were absolutely right to scrap the winter fuel payment. It is preposterous that a universal benefit is paid to the wealthiest cohort of pensioners in British history when many of them do not need it. On the WASPy women, Labour were also right about that, because however difficult the circumstances many of these women unfortunately have found themselves in, they had 15 years in which to acquaint themselves with the change in the pensionable age. Nobody can say that was not something that they could see coming.
The polling suggests that most voters disagree with you.
Oh, absolutely, but the voters are capable of being wrong too.
Definitely disagree with
you.
All right.
But that's why I say no good deed goes unpunished.
Okay.
You know, and politically, this has clearly been disastrous for Labour, but, you know, they're actually being punished for doing the right thing, in my opinion.
All right. Now, look, 2 people now have mentioned issues associated with energy policy here in Scotland, so let's have a question about it. From Ed Johnston.
What should be done next now that the Scottish Court of Session has questioned approval for the Rosebank and Jack Doyle oil fields?
So what's happened is just for those who aren't familiar, or those of you at home who are not familiar with this, last week a judge quashed consent for the Jackdaw gas field and the Rosebank oil field, and the judge said that permission to drill must now be applied for again because the original approvals failed to consider what emissions are generated, not only in terms of building the thing, getting the oil and gas, but it failed to consider what emissions are created when the oil and the gas are burnt. So now we've got a position where the companies who want to drill in these two places are going back and looking at their policies again. But eventually, the government will have to decide, the Westminster government will have to decide whether or not these projects can go ahead. You would want them to go ahead, Russell?
Without any question. The SNP, of course, spent years telling us it's Scotland's oil. Now they want to keep it under the sea. It's an act of national self-harm to not extract this oil. We are going to need, as a nation, oil and gas for decades to come. And what these parties, both Labour and the SNP, would rather do is not extract it, but import it from countries around the world who are often not our friends and allies, and a much greater harm to the environment. It makes absolutely no sense. And what we're seeing happening at Grangemouth, with hundreds of workers getting their redundancy notices this week, is a direct result of this chilling effect, this hostility from the Labour government and the SNP government towards oil and gas.
Imagine that during a climate crisis.
It says something that Unite the Union is fighting a campaign to save the jobs at Grangemouth, and every single one of my Scottish Conservative colleagues in Holyrood support that campaign, and the majority of Labour MSPs have gone to ground, are in hiding, and it's absolutely ludicrous.
Lorna.
The question is, what do we do next? And the question is, we move forward with the energy strategy we have in Scotland. So I'm an electromechanical engineer. I worked in renewable energy before I was elected. We have enormous potential in Scotland to generate renewable energy. We know this. We're putting in place the biggest offshore wind farms in the world, some of the biggest ones in the world. We know from our published energy strategy that we can do this. We don't need those fields, either for our own energy. So Russell is misrepresenting this. If we did drill oil from the North Sea, that isn't kept for Scotland. We don't keep that aside. It's drilled by commercial companies, by big mega corporations who sell it on the open market. They don't keep it for Scotland. That's not how that works. So that does not contribute in any way to our energy security. What does give us energy security, what will move us forward in terms of creating new jobs and those new opportunities, is investing in our renewable potential. And we're so lucky in Scotland to have that. There are massive opportunities ahead for us. And actually, the challenge is getting enough people into the jobs. So we talk about job creation. There are well-paid, excellent jobs out there ahead of you for young people, for anyone transitioning into that industry,
every North
and they
Sea
need
worker
to move
on the scrap heap. That's
we
your
need
party's
to
position.
phase out oil and gas, and we need to help people working in that industry as that industry declines, because it will decline, and anyone telling you otherwise is being dishonest with you. We need to be honest about that decline and not do what we did to Grangemouth, where the Conservatives, and I'm afraid even the SNP, were saying, we can keep doing this forever, guys. It's going to be fine. It's not going to be fine.
Which is an oil refinery, and now
Grangemouth
that's
is
not
an oil
going to do that
refinery.
anymore.
It's not going to be fine. And actually, I think the UK government holds some responsibility for Grangemouth, because Grangemouth has the ability to be converted to biofuels and indeed to, in the long term, things like green hydrogen. So that refinery could be repurposed to other things. But the UK government chose to prioritise repurposing refineries down in England and has been once again neglecting investment in Scotland.
OK. Great up, yeah.
I think the key here is it's not either or. It should be a combination of factors. Yeah. You can't just turn off the oil overnight. We're going to need it for a period of time, especially if the Russians and the people that control some of these pipelines are not necessarily our friends. The key here is to have a combination strategy. Wind and renewables is great. There's also new generations of nuclear. Yep. Much cleaner, smaller nuclear plants that are much more efficient.
We don't need it, though.
And if we put them together with the other options, where all our eggs are no longer in the one basket.
OK. So, Michael, let me come to you. So, as I say that the government at Westminster is going to have the final say on whether the Rosebank oil field should go ahead. Now, given that your boss has called it a colossal waste of taxpayer money and climate vandalism, I presume the government's position is it shouldn't go ahead.
Well, let's be really clear in this particular case. The courts last week ruled that the previous decision by the previous government was unlawful.
No, I've said all that. So what's the government's position?
Now what we've got to do is put in place a process so that if they wish to reapply, and I assume they will, but that's for the companies to do so, they will go through the new environmental impact process, which takes into account, as you said, the end-use emissions. And they'll have to make their own case for why they think their application should be approved. And then it will be decided in a quasi-judicial way. It's wrong for me to comment because it is my department that will be making a decision on
this. But that's exactly surely why you should comment, because it's going to be down to you. So, I mean, I'm puzzled by that. I mean, if it was something outside your department, that would be one thing. But this is absolutely your department. Your boss is dead set against it. What's your position?
Well, I think it's quite the opposite, in fact. If you have a direct responsibility for making a decision that's not a political choice, it's a quasi-judicial decision on a particular piece of environmental impact assessments, it's really, really important I don't state a particular view. And so I'm not going to comment on those two cases. But I think there's a wider question here. And actually, I think the gentleman's point...
well, the question was very specific about those two things, actually, which is why I was asking you. But you're not prepared to say.
A number of other things have come up in the questions, and I want to just respond to them. And on the Grangemouth point, first of all, it's incredibly disappointing this week that redundancy notices are being handed out. But I'll tell you, I came into this job 7 months ago, and one of the first things in my in-tray was the situation at Grangemouth. It didn't arrive in July with the election of a Labour government. We've known for 10 years that Grangemouth was in a precarious position. We've known for 2 years with some certainty that it was likely to close. There wasn't a single plan from the Conservative government or from the SNP. Not a single thing had been done, even though they knew this decision was coming.
Admit. No, you
not a single thing.
The reason that Grangemouth had lasted for as long as it had is because of financial support that we had put in place and plans for its future, which is why the earlier question was factually... Well, you know as well as I do that for the long-term future of Grangemouth, it requires substantial investment and a focus on sustainable aviation fuel, on carbon capture and storage. These are big, substantial infrastructure developments that you know we can only do jointly.
So let me then follow up on that point, because we have had a good working relationship since we came in. We've reset the relationship with the Scottish Government, and actually on this issue, we've worked really closely together. But we've had 7 months to try and come up with this. We jointly put in money for Project Willow, which is around making sure there's a sustainable industrial future to Grangemouth, not just from year to year, but something that's a real investable proposition for our workforce in the future. But I wish we'd been starting this work 5 years ago. We have had 7 months.
OK, you've made that point.
We should have been doing this years ago, and both these governments knew this was coming.
Let's come back to the question at hand. Ed, what should be done now that the court's overturned approval for the Rosebank and Jackdaw oil fields? Now, let me come to you, Kate.
Yeah.
Nicola Sturgeon. She described the Rosebank oil field as the greatest act of environmental vandalism in my lifetime. So I presume you don't support it either.
Well, my position is on the ruling, and it is a court ruling, is very much in keeping with the argument that we have made over the last few years, which is that in order to grant licensing, it has to be compatible with a strict climate change test. That did not exist under the Conservatives. They were drill, baby, drill.
OK, but hang on, Nicola Sturgeon didn't say that. She just said exploring that Rosebank oil field would be the greatest act of environmental vandalism. Was she wrong?
I prefer to speak for myself.
No, but was she wrong? I mean, it's a bit inconvenient, these leaders saying these things.
In terms of our position on what has been ruled on.
Okay.
And the point here is that any company, any industry needs certainty. And our approach was that under the previous Conservative government that did have a completely dismissive approach to this, we needed strict climate change compatibility tests. Now, you have to take into account energy security as well, which is why the gentleman is absolutely right that we are on the cusp of one of the biggest opportunities for the Scottish economy in probably any of our lifetimes. Some of you may remember the last revolution in terms of oil and gas, but right now what we are looking at in terms of the opportunity completely exceeds what happened under the last revolution with renewables and the energy transition. But It has to create jobs. It is creating jobs. We talked about Grangemouth and the opportunities for Grangemouth. Last week, the Chancellor talked about the need for growth, and she talked about sustainable aviation fuel. Grangemouth is perfectly located for that. We've been long advocating for carbon capture, utilisation and storage. Scotland is perfectly situated for that, with all the skills, the infrastructure, the funding.
Let me just drag you back to Jackdaw and Rosebank.
But your question was what happens next. And
yes,
my point
and I'm
here,
wondering, well, if the two companies now that want to drill in these two areas now have to come up with new arguments to persuade the court that they have taken into account these new factors. If they do,
well,
I appreciate that's an if. It's cool, and I'm not asking you that. What I'm saying is, if those two areas are to be drilled, is that something the SNP would approve of?
We have said really clearly what the court has just ruled.
No, but would you approve of those two the oil field? Would you approve of that, of those being drilled?
Well, you know we can't grant licences, but if...
No, I'm just asking, would you approve? Do you support that as a policy?
It has to be compatible with the climate change test we've just outlined. So the court has literally just ruled that they have to take into account not just the impact of the drilling, but basically the impact of the emissions that are generated when it's used. That's a rough paraphrase. And we've said, well, prove it to us that it's compatible with your climate change. I'm not going to prejudge what comes out, because my point here is that we are focused on job creation, on investment, and I'm not going to get hung up on what a company may or may not do.
I'm simply trying to ascertain whether the SNP backs new drilling or not. Alex, and I haven't got an answer for that. Alex.
Well, the SNP back the oil industry when oil prices are high, and they don't back it so much when oil prices are low. I mean, the SNP complains about the rate of tax on North Sea oil, which is approaching 80%, tax rate hiked by the Conservative Party, it might be pointed out, which obviously acts as a disincentive to further investment in what is admittedly a declining basin. But, there's an awful lot of humbug talked about energy policy. The gentleman in the audience was absolutely right that it is not a question of oil or renewables. It's not an either-or thing. It is clearly a question of utilising both, because oil isn't just about power generation. It's also vital to the manufacturing of thousands of everyday products, from medicines to chemicals to paper, 100 other things. And one of the things we also have to look at, and we had a very big problem in the United Kingdom for a long, long time now about failing to take long-term views of things and make plans appropriately. And that's not just a question of energy policy, that's evident across a whole realm of policy areas. But energy is particularly difficult. If you look at the next 20 years, with all the changes that are forecast and anticipated, we are going to need twice the energy capacity we have now. So closing the North Sea, on however a gradual basis and so on, is a fairly short-term and blinkered approach to take. At the same time, yes, of course, the future is largely renewable, but it isn't solely renewable, because the problems of what to do with intermittency when it comes to renewable energy supply have not yet been solved. Battery storage will play a part in that in the future. New technologies will doubtless play a part of that in the future. Carbon capture can play a part of that. So too, obviously, can nuclear, particularly with regard to the need for huge new power-munching data centres with regard to artificial intelligence and other things. So that's why you have, in the United States, companies such as Microsoft investing in small modular nuclear reactors. It's why the same sort of things are going to be required here to have a consistent and guaranteed baseload energy supply. Energy is a multi-stranded problem, but you can't just have it, reduce it to this sort of simplistic, oil bad or oil good, or renewables good, renewables bad. It's much more complicated than that, and you need a bit of everything.
All right. Let me take one more question. Just got time to fit it in. From Claire McGoldrick.
As a hospital consultant, I'm dismayed by the continued long waiting times in emergency departments. Now, that's despite the very, very hard work of staff. How can this problem be solved?
Well, the NHS, of course, is a devolved matter here in Scotland. Kate.
So waiting times are too long. There's a number of reasons for that. There's the impact of the fact that we didn't have operations ongoing for a while during COVID. There's the fact that we have an ageing population. There's the fact that we have challenges in terms of recruitment. The issue is not whether there are difficulties, because we accept that there are difficulties. The question is whether there's a plan to respond to that. And the First Minister set out a couple of weeks ago his plan, and it's essentially to focus resources on where it's required the most. And you'll know, because you work in that environment, that one of the issues in our hospitals is delayed discharge. So people in hospital that shouldn't be in hospital that are occupying beds that could be used by someone on that waiting list. So supporting the social care sector to ensure that there's a greater throughput on through our hospitals will relieve some of the waiting time. So
can I just ask you about that? Because
yeah.
the SNP first promised to end delayed discharges, which is what you're talking about here, within a year.
When
in
was that?
2015.
In 2015.
And it's now 2025. I mean, the last figures are September last year, and the average number of beds occupied per day due to people being delayed in hospital was nearly 2,000.
And
So you've been trying to sort this out since 2015.
It's an even more pressing issue than it was back in 2015.
So why have you not managed to sort it out in 10 years?
Well, for the reasons that I've just outlined. Because you have to understand what is driving it. In that period of time, in terms of, for example, the social care workforce, unemployment is 3.9% at the moment. In terms of recruiting, there's not a business in the country and a public sector body in the country that won't tell you how difficult it is.
So can I just check? So in the 10 years, do you think, and I appreciate you're saying there are other factors, and of course there's some reason to that, but given that you've not sorted this out in 10 years, do you think the SNP has got it all right in those 10 years when it comes to delayed discharge, or any things you concede you've done wrong?
I don't know if you have a figure back in 2015, because I imagine it was a lot lower than it is right now.
Well, yeah, but in fact, you promised us to get rid of it in 2015.
And it has got worse because of the factors that I have outlined. But I'm not telling you that there aren't challenges. What I'm saying is that countries across the world are grappling with issues that are affecting us, and the question is how we respond. The fact that the NHS is performing as well as it is down to your hard work and the hard work of your colleagues. But in terms of the plan, it's focusing the resource on where it will matter the most. And just yesterday, we voted for £23 billion as part of the budget in our NHS and social care. But the other two elements are about reform of the NHS, so building up capacity with the Hospital at Home programme so that people don't have to come into hospital in the first place. And the third one is the one that never gets much airtime or attention, is preventative. So how do you support people before they actually need acute care? That's the three-point plan. That is the plan that we're focusing on. None of us are hiding from the fact that there are issues, and we're enormously grateful to our doctors and our nurses who are keeping the thing going.
But you have had 17 years to sort this out.
And it's fluctuated over
Under
that
Tory
time.
austerity,
In terms of the challenges.
No austerity in Scotland.
But Alex, you're good at understanding root causes of things. And surely you would even appreciate that in terms of the last few years of struggling finances, in terms of ageing population, in terms of challenges to recruit, they're all factors.
Let me bring some of the audience in. Yes.
Hiya, I'm a final year medical student and I'm meant to be starting work this summer, if it will go to plan. But I want to know what's going to be done to actually try and retain the doctors and nurses that are coming through training and choosing to leave the NHS because of burnout, because of the amount of stress that they have to go through. Why aren't the doctors that are being trained here wanting to stay, and what's going to be done about it?
Okay. I'll come around this time. Yes.
Hi, Fiona. Actually, I know a few doctors that are actually left for Australia simply because it's a better class of working environment where when they get there and they have more social time and everything else that's with it when they go there. And what I would say to Kate is that I can't understand why you think that you did a great job with the NHS, because are you asking for another 10 years to put it right? Because at the end of the day, you have done nothing. And can we look to politicians to fix it? I don't think so, because you don't know yourselves what the hell to do with it.
Michael.
Well, I think what we saw from John Swinney, who, let's not forget, has been round the cabinet table for most of the almost 2 decades the SNP's been in power, was, I think, the 5th NHS recovery plan in 4 years. We're going through recovery plans quite well, but not actually implementing the change that we all want to see. And there's far too many people in this country, 1 in 6 of us, on an NHS waiting list. The chances are there's people in this room or people that you know on that waiting list. I have constituents come to me every single week with stories about cashing in pensions to get operations that they've been waiting for years, cashing in savings to go private, not because they believe in private healthcare, but because they can't wait for operations. So the first stage, I think, Claire, to your question directly, is to accept there's a problem and not to pretend that everything is fine in our NHS. The problem is we need to accept there are real challenges around workforce retention, I think is really critical. The staff we have in the NHS are phenomenal, but they're working in a system that isn't working. and they're having to work doubly hard to meet the requirements that they have to make to provide the patient care that they do. We should be doing much more in this. And look,
briefly,
the truth is,
I've got 5 minutes.
The truth is, it comes back to the first question. Because this Labour government chose to end austerity so that there was the money in the budget that Kate could put into the NHS. What we now need to see is not just more money, but a genuine change in government, because after 20 years, the SNP is incapable of change, and we need the change in the NHS now for all the people that we know are on waiting lists and who need the healthcare that they're not getting.
We've got very little time left, so briefly.
Well, I think it's very important to remind viewers elsewhere in the United Kingdom that the SNP government are wholly responsible for the NHS in Scotland and have been for almost 18 years.
But not for the money that pays for it.
When I speak are put to John Swinney. His repeated failings. He seems to be the only person in Scotland that it comes as a surprise to him when winter comes along every year. Just a few weeks ago, the Royal College of Nursing produced a report that was heartbreaking. It laid bare the reality of what it's like in hospitals across Scotland. And this government is good at making excuses. It's fantastic at producing reviews and talking shops and round tables. It's clearly not going
brilliantly in England either, can I point out?
Indeed.
Yeah,
exactly.
I'm not going to fall into the trap of nationalism and start trying to point the finger elsewhere. I'm talking about what's happening in Scotland.
And can we not agree, surely, that it's better than in Labour-run Wales?
That's
one of the stock lines.
Politicians. That's a stock line of John Swinney's. He's always wanting to point the finger elsewhere. We're responsible for what's happening in Scotland.
So, Lorna, you made the point. You made the point that the SNP don't control how much money they get. They obviously control how much money they spend of the money they get on the NHS. Are you saying it's just about money? And
well, all roads lead to Westminster. The money that Scotland has to spend on things like the NHS comes from Westminster. That is where it comes from. And while Labour we're glad, increased that, they haven't made up for 14 years of underspending. Where we have done better with that money in Scotland is doctors and nurses are paid better in Scotland than they are in England. And we are proud of being able to deliver that while the Greens were in government. We're so pleased to be able to pay our NHS workers more fairly. But the stories are heartbreaking from workers and from patients in the NHS. And it will take the Labour government in Westminster to make up for the 14 years of austerity with a proper investment in the NHS. You cannot fix 14 years of a problem with 1 year of making it slightly less bad.
And let me just come back to this man, because you made a point right at the very beginning.
Thank you very much, Fiona. I would just like to ask, what is the Scottish Government doing about mental health? If you don't have your health, you have absolutely nothing. It is 18 weeks. 18 weeks to see somebody. That is ridiculous. And nothing's getting done about it. And nobody seems to care.
Kate briefly answer, then I must bring Alex in very
quickly. In terms
of
mental health, substantially more funding and a greater focus on mental health. It is also part of our commitment to prevention. So supporting people before they get to an acute stage.
Are you committed to reducing this 18-week waiting list?
Absolutely. In terms of reducing the number of waiting time, the waiting list. Our commitment is to ensure that we support people to get the care that they need when they need it as quickly as possible.
Alex.
It's impossible.
Yeah, I mean, the NHS isn't just broken in Scotland, it's broken in England, it's broken in Wales, it's broken in Northern Ireland, which does suggest that perhaps it's the model of the NHS that may have something to do with it. But, you know, on Lorna's point about, you know, blaming all roads lead to Westminster and austerity, well, yes and no. The plain fact of the matter is that public spending in Scotland amounts to between 50 and 51% of GDP. That is 4 or 5 points higher than it is in the UK as a whole. So the claim that there has been austerity in Scotland over the last 15 years doesn't really stack up when cumulative levels of public spending are so high. The question is why, you know, since public services are funded around 20% more per capita in Scotland than they are elsewhere in the UK, the question is, are outcomes 20% better?
We have more challenges in terms of geography, islands, ferries. It's much harder to deliver public services in Scotland. Much more expensive.
Yeah, it is more expensive to deliver public services in the Highlands and Islands and in Argyll, certainly, than it is elsewhere. But that doesn't account for the entirety of the difference in public spending, Scotland.
No, some of it is that we pay our workers better.
Well, that doesn't deliver better outcomes for patients, though, does it? Does paying nurses deliver better outcomes than, say, buying more MRI scanners?
Does paying doctors and nurses properly lead to better outcomes? I'd love the doctor to answer that question.
Well, if you have a bigger workforce, then patients will be seeing
But we do have a bigger workforce. We have more doctors and nurses, not just in the NHS in Scotland, but in the NHS across the UK than was the case in 2019 before COVID. And yet fewer operations and fewer procedures are being carried out across the UK than was the case in 2019, which suggests it's not just a staffing problem.
OK. I'm going to end it there. Because we've run out of time. And I'm sure the NHS is something we will come back to. Not just Donald Trump, as I said at the beginning, but the NHS as well. That is a perennial on Question Time. Let me end it there. Thank you very much to the panel. Thank you for all your contributions. Thank you, of course, to all of you for being here and putting your points. And thank you to you at home for watching. Remember, we are in Northwich in Cheshire next week, and the week after that is our programme with a special focus on Ukraine. But for now, from Glasgow, bye-bye.
Newscast in front of a live audience next on BBC One, taking us back to where it all began 5 years ago. Is the Brexit debate starting to heat up again?